She worked long hours at the little cafe tucked on a quiet street. The cafe was the kind of place where people came for a quick coffee or a sandwich, where the sounds of steaming milk, clattering dishes, and low murmurs of conversation filled the air. For most of the customers, she was invisible. She moved with quiet efficiency, refilling cups, taking orders, clearing tables. Her uniform was neat, her smile polite, but she was never the center of attention. Most people didn't even remember her name after leaving. And that was exactly how she'd always been used to life. No one laughed with her. No one teased her in a friendly way. If anyone noticed her at all, it was only to complain that their order was late, or to mutter about how small the tip was. She had learned early on not to take it personally because life had been like that for her. People often judged before they knew, and she had long stopped trying to explain herself. Her coworkers didn't help. They were friendly enough on the surface, sharing jokes and stories, but she was always the outsider. When they spoke in small groups during breaks, she would quietly sip her tea at the corner table, pretending to read a menu. Sometimes she would glance at them, hoping for an invitation to join, but it never came. That was fine, she told herself. She was used to being alone. The cafe had an old piano tucked in a dark corner near the windows. It wasn't new. The wood was scratched, and the keys had yellowed with age. A layer of dust covered it, as if it had been forgotten. Customers rarely noticed it, and even if they did, they assumed it was just decoration. Some evenings the staff would joke about it, saying it had seen better days or played better hands. She had walked past it hundreds of times, never touching it, never imagining that it could change anything. Yet, something about the piano called to her. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was the way the evening light hit the worn keys, or the faint smell of old polish lingering in the wood. Sometimes, during the slow hours of the cafe, she would pause near it, brushing her fingers over the keys without pressing them. A quiet memory would stir. Memory of music, notes flowing from her fingertips like water. Of afternoons spent at a piano bench when the world outside didn't matter. Music had always been her escape. When she was a child, her parents had encouraged her to learn. She had loved it, practicing for hours, feeling the rhythm and melody fill the small room of their home. But life had a way of shifting dreams aside. Moving to a new city, working odd jobs, paying bills, her piano had gone silent for years. She had promised herself she would play again someday, but someday always seemed too far away. Tonight, the cafe was quieter than usual. Only a few customers lingered, sipping coffee and reading newspapers. She had finished clearing the last few tables, stacking chairs, and wiping the counters clean. The smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of pastries. The clock ticked slowly, each second marking the end of another day she had spent in routine, unnoticed. She found herself standing near the piano, looking down at the keys. They looked strange and familiar at the same time. Dust covered the surface, and a few keys were chipped, but the instrument had a presence that was hard to ignore. Her heart ached as memories came rushing back, her fingers dancing over the keys. The music filling the room, the small applause from her teacher, the way her mother would hum along while she played. It had been a long time, but the feelings were still alive. For a moment, she considered sitting down. No one was watching. The cafe was empty enough. Just one small song, she thought, just to feel the notes again. She had been avoiding this moment for years, afraid of what might happen if she'd tried and failed. What if her fingers didn't remember? What if the music had left her? But as she looked at the piano, a quiet determination grew inside her. She needed to know. Slowly, she pulled back the small cover that protected the keys. It creaked softly, protesting years of neglect. She pressed one key gently. A sound, imperfect but alive, filled the corner. Her heart leapt. She pressed another, then another, and suddenly a simple melody began to take shape. It was not perfect, far from it, but it was music, and it was hers. She closed her eyes, letting the melody guide her. Her fingers remembered movements she hadn't consciously thought of in years. Each note brought a memory, a feeling she had buried under long days of work and long nights of quiet loneliness. The notes flowed from her, tentative at first, then bolder, stronger. She could hear herself again, truly herself, in a way she hadn't for years. Outside, the city hummed softly. Cars passed by, people walked home from work, and the night began to settle over the streets. Inside the cafe, the sound of the piano filled the space that had once felt empty. She didn't notice time passing. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't invisible. She was alive in the music, and the music was alive in her. When she finally opened her eyes, she realized she had been playing for a long time. Her fingers ached, but she didn't care. The room was quiet again, except for the fading echoes of her song. She knew no one had heard her. She wasn't performing for anyone. Yet the feeling of reclaiming this part of herself was exhilarating. She had found something she thought she had lost forever. She sat there for a while, letting the silence wash over her, feeling the energy of the music linger in the air. She didn't know what would happen next, and she didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt hope stir inside her. Maybe someday someone would hear her. Maybe someday the piano wouldn't be empty. But tonight, she had rediscovered her voice. Finally, she closed the piano gently, careful not to damage the old wood. She brushed her hands together, feeling the warmth of the notes still lingering in her fingertips. She looked around the cafe, seeing it with new eyes. The tables, the chairs, the counters, they hadn't changed, but she had. Something inside her had shifted. She had remembered who she was, and what she could do. As she turned off the lights and locked the door, she felt a quiet excitement. The cafe was still the same place, quiet and unnoticed. But she had changed. And she knew that change had the power to grow, to reach beyond these walls, to touch others in ways she could not yet imagine. That night, walking home under the soft glow of streetlights, she hummed the melody she had played. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a promise to herself. She had survived. She had waited. And now she had returned to what she loved. No one had laughed yet. No one had doubted her. But tomorrow, she would be ready for whatever came next, because the piano had remembered her. And she had remembered herself. And sometimes, that was enough to begin a new story. The next afternoon, the cafe was busier than usual. The late spring sun filtered through the windows, casting patterns of light across the tables. She moved among the customers, carrying trays of coffee and plates of sandwiches. Her steps were quiet, but purposeful. She had learned to move like this over the years, efficient, polite, unobtrusive. But today, there was a small spark in her chest. The memory of playing the piano the night before still lingered, a gentle hum of hope and excitement. The cafe had a few regulars who always came at the same time each day. They were friendly enough in their own way, but they had never really noticed her beyond taking their orders. Today, one of them leaned over as she passed with a tray and said, "Hey, why don't you play that old piano in the corner for us? We could use some entertainment." His tone was teasing, almost mocking, and the others at the table laughed. It was lighthearted, but not meant to be encouraging. She froze for a moment, her hands gripping the tray a little tighter. She had hoped no one would mention the piano, at least not yet. But something in her stirred, a mixture of nerves and determination. She looked at the table of customers, the laughter, the smirks, and realized this was the moment she had been waiting for, though she didn't know it yet. "I could try," she said softly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the words carried more weight than she imagined. The laughter grew a little louder. They didn't expect much. Maybe they expected failure. Maybe they thought it would be funny. She wasn't sure, and she didn't care. Setting the tray down, she walked to the piano. Her fingers brushed the keys lightly, testing them, feeling the texture of the worn wood beneath her fingertips. The customers leaned back in their chairs, some smiling, some smirking, some pulling out their phones as if to record something amusing. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting. But she let the quiet concentration of the piano take over. The first note was tentative, soft, almost uncertain. A small, imperfect sound echoed in the cafe. A few customers laughed quietly, shaking their heads, as if to say this will be short and funny. She ignored them. She closed her eyes and let the memory of last night's music guide her. The notes began to flow, slow at first, then with more confidence. It was not a fast or flashy piece. It was simple, gentle, and full of emotion. The music moved through the room like a soft wind, brushing against each person in a way they hadn't expected. The laughter began to fade, almost instinctively. Conversations that had been ongoing stopped. Even the customers who had been recording pulled their phones down, their faces changing as they realized something unexpected was happening. Her fingers danced over the keys, guided not just by skill, but by the memory of every hour she had ever spent practicing, learning, and loving the piano. Each note held a part of her story, the loneliness, the hard work, the dream she had once held close. She wasn't playing to impress anyone. She was playing because it was a part of her. The sound filled the cafe, rising above the hum of the espresso machine and the clatter of dishes. Taking over every quiet corner, some of the customers leaned forward, mesmerized. A few whispered to each other, unsure of how to respond. The laughter had completely disappeared, replaced by a stunned silence that felt heavy and beautiful all at once. The cafe owner, who had been stacking cups behind the counter, stopped mid-motion, listening with his mouth slightly open. He had seen many performers, but none like this. There was a presence in her playing that could not be ignored. She opened her eyes slightly, glancing at the people around her. They were watching, but not in the way she had feared. Their eyes were wide, some sparkling with surprise, others softening as they realized this music was real, honest, and heartfelt. She let herself feel the connection, the bridge forming between her and the strangers in the cafe. The piano had always been her private world, but now it had become a shared one. The melody shifted subtly, moving from gentle, slow notes to a slightly stronger, more expressive passage. She had always loved this part of a song, the way it could carry energy, tension, and release all at once. Her fingers flew over the keys, not with force, but with precision and feeling. The customers leaned closer, their laughter completely gone. Even the ones who had teased her now watched with a quiet awe. As if seeing her for the first time, a man in the back who had been scrolling on his phone stopped mid-scroll. He looked up, his eyes widening, and put the device down. A woman sipping her coffee almost spilled it, mesmerized by the music. Even the young couple in the corner, who had been whispering to each other, now sat quietly, their heads slightly tilted as they listened. The cafe felt smaller somehow, intimate and alive with sound. She didn't notice the time passing. The music carried her away, filling every part of her being. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. For the first time, she realized that she was not just a waitress in a quiet cafe. She was a musician. She was someone who had something to offer the world. And right now, the world, however small, was listening. As the final notes lingered in the air, she let them fade gently, like a soft sigh. The cafe was silent for a long moment. No one moved. No one spoke. The coffee machines and the clatter of dishes seemed distant, muted by the power of what had just been played. Then, slowly, a hand clapped. Then another. The applause began quietly, then grew steadily, echoing off the walls. It was not loud or overwhelming, but it was real, sincere, and it filled her heart with a warmth she had forgotten existed. The customers who had laughed first were now looking at her with new eyes. Their smiles were genuine, tinged with admiration and respect. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief. "I didn't expect that," one of them murmured. "She's amazing," she smiled faintly, feeling a strange mix of relief and pride. She hadn't played for approval or recognition, but it felt good to be seen, to be acknowledged. The cafe owner came forward, clapping alongside the customers. "That was incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine surprise. "I didn't know you could play like that." She shrugged slightly, embarrassed but happy. "It's been a long time," she admitted softly. "I just hadn't played in a while." Where she had learned to play and whether she had performed before, she answered quietly, not wanting to sound boastful, simply sharing a part of her life she had kept private for so long. Every question, every attentive glance felt like a bridge being built between her past and the present. Between the quiet girl they had ignored and the woman sitting at the piano. By the time she stepped away from the piano, the atmosphere in the cafe had changed completely. The energy was lighter, warmer, and full of curiosity. The piano, once forgotten in the corner, now felt alive, as if it had been waiting for her all these years. She glanced at it, a small smile tugging at her lips, knowing that this was only the beginning. Even the customers who had laughed at the thought of her playing seemed reluctant to leave. Some lingered, sipping coffee slowly, as if savoring the experience they had just witnessed. Others whispered to each other, replaying the moment in their minds. The teasing had turned into respect, the doubt into admiration. They had expected nothing, and instead, they had discovered something remarkable. For her, the experience was life-changing. She had faced the laughter, the doubt, and the teasing, and she had not only survived, but shone. It was proof that the parts of herself she had buried, her talent, her passion, her music, were still there, waiting to be claimed. The cafe had not changed, the customers had not changed, but she had. She had remembered what it felt like to play, to share, and to be seen. That evening after the cafe closed and the last customer had left, she stayed behind again. The piano waited in the corner, silent but full of potential. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, smiling at the memory of the day. The laughter had been replaced by wonder. The mocking glances had been replaced by eyes that saw her. And she knew that the world would never look at her the same way again. She played for a long time that night, letting the music flow freely. Every note was a declaration, a promise to herself that she would never hide her talent again. The cafe had given her the stage, even if small, and she intended to use it. She had faced ridicule, and it had turned into recognition. She had faced doubt, and it had turned into belief. And as she closed the piano and walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, she felt a quiet, powerful joy. For the first time in a long time, she felt unstoppable. She had played for herself, for the piano, for the silent hours of practice she had spent alone. And now she had played for others, and they had listened. The laughter that had been aimed at her was gone, replaced by something far more important: respect, attention, and perhaps the beginning of something she had never dared to dream of again. Tomorrow, she thought, she would return. And when she did, she would play again, stronger, braver, and ready for whatever came next. The cafe, the piano, and the people who had laughed first had given her a gift, the gift of being seen, the gift of being heard, and the gift of knowing that her music mattered. And that was only the beginning. The cafe had never felt so alive. Even days after her first small performance, people still talked about the music she had played. A few of the regulars came back, hoping to hear more, while some new faces wandered in, curious after hearing the whispers. She went about her work as usual, but there was a quiet tension in the air, a sense that something unusual was about to happen. That afternoon, a group of college students came in, carrying backpacks and laughing loudly. One of them spotted the piano in the corner and nudged the others. "Hey, let's see if the piano girl is here today," he said, smirking. They had heard stories about her performance the day before, but they weren't sure if it was real. Some of them rolled their eyes, others looked skeptical. None of them expected much. She noticed them as she cleared a table, quietly wiping down the surface while pretending not to notice. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but inside, a small flutter of nerves reminded her that the world could still be unpredictable. What if they laughed? What if this time the music wasn't enough? She drew a deep breath and forced herself to focus on her work, telling herself that she didn't need anyone's approval to play. A few minutes later, one of the students called out, "Hey, you. Yeah, you. Can you play something for us?" The others laughed, clearly expecting her to either refuse or fail. She felt their eyes on her as she walked slowly toward the piano, her fingers brushing the keys lightly. The wood was warm under her touch, familiar and welcoming. She closed her eyes and let the memory of her music guide her again. The first notes were soft, delicate, almost hesitant, but the moment she began, something changed. The laughter stopped. Even the students, who had come to tease, leaned back in their seats, unsure how to react. The melody grew, slow and careful at first, then richer and deeper. She let her emotions flow through the music, her loneliness, her determination, the years she had spent waiting for someone to notice. Every note carried a piece of her story. The room shifted. Conversations faded into silence. The hum of the espresso machine, the clatter of dishes, the background noise of the cafe all seemed to disappear, replaced by the living, breathing sound of the piano. The students exchanged glances, their smirks fading. They had expected something funny, something easy to mock, but this was something else entirely. She opened her eyes slightly, catching the expressions of the people around her. The regulars, who had seen her perform before, were leaning forward, captivated. A few of the new customers had stopped mid-sip, frozen in awe. Even the cafe owner, who had come out from behind the counter to watch, stood silently, shaking his head in disbelief. There was a presence in her playing that no one could ignore. Her fingers moved over the keys with confidence now, guided by memory and instinct. She played a song she'd once learned as a child, one full of emotion and longing. It was a song that spoke of dreams that had been delayed but never lost. As the melody rose and fell, the cafe seemed to breathe with her, every note resonating in the walls, in the air. I'm in the hearts of the listeners. One of the students shifted in his seat, clearly affected. He had come to laugh, to show his friends that the piano girl was just a waitress who might stumble. But now he sat silently, unsure what to say. Another student whispered, She's really good. His friend nodded slowly, eyes wide. The laughter that had filled the room moments ago had vanished completely, replaced by something heavier, something real. She didn't play for applause. She didn't play for recognition. She played because the music was part of her. It was who she was. Each note was a small declaration, a proof of her resilience, a reminder that she had survived years of being overlooked and underestimated. And now, those same people who had expected nothing were listening, fully and completely, to the voice they had ignored. The melody grew stronger, more expressive. She let herself feel the music fully, letting every memory, every moment of doubt and hope pour out of her fingertips. She played with a freedom she hadn't felt in years. The students leaned forward, captivated, their previous arrogance replaced with respect. The cafe owner whispered to himself, I didn't know she could do that. Even the regular customers, who had witnessed this before, were moved anew. Some tapping their fingers lightly in time with the rhythm, some closing their eyes to absorb the sound. A young woman near the window wiped a tear from her eye, caught off guard by the sudden emotion the music had stirred. She hadn't come to the cafe for anything more than a coffee. But now she sat, still and silent, letting the piano reach her in a way she hadn't expected. Another man whispered to his companion, It's like she's telling a story. Without words, the more she played, the more she realized the effect her music had. It wasn't just the sound, it was the honesty, the vulnerability. It's a courage to stand and play in front of people who had once laughed at her. The music carried her past the fear, past the doubt, and into a space where only her talent and her heart mattered. Every person in the room, no matter their intentions when they arrived, felt it. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different life. One where she wasn't invisible, one where her music could reach beyond this small cafe, beyond the quiet streets, to touch people who had never known her name. But she quickly returned to the present, focusing on the notes beneath her fingers, feeling the sound vibrate through her body. She was grounded in the music, and that was enough. As the song reached its conclusion, final notes hung in the air, delicate and trembling. The room stayed silent for a heartbeat longer, as if none of the listeners wanted to break the spell. Then, slowly, applause began. It started quietly, almost hesitantly, but soon it grew, filling the cafe with warmth and recognition. The students who had come to mock were now clapping enthusiastically, their eyes wide with admiration. Even the ones who hadn't expected much were leaning forward, smiling, whispering to each other about the beauty of what they had just witnessed. The cafe owner approached her again, his face lit with pride. I don't know what to say, he said, shaking his head. You've changed this place. You've changed all of us. She smiled faintly, feeling a mixture of shyness and pride. She didn't need to say anything. The music had spoken for her. It had said more than words ever could. Some customers lingered even after finishing their drinks. hesitant to leave the atmosphere the music had created. They whispered softly among themselves, replaying what they had just heard. The piano, once a forgotten object in the corner, had become the heart of the cafe. It had a presence now, alive with the memory of her playing. And she felt it too, like a pulse that matched her own heartbeat, as she returned to her work. Carrying trays and taking orders, she noticed the way people now looked at her. There was a new respect, a recognition that hadn't been there before. It wasn't about fame or attention, it was about being seen, truly seen, for something real and meaningful. And for the first time, she felt that her place in the world could be more than just a quiet corner behind a counter. After the cafe closed that evening, she lingered near the piano, her fingers brushing the keys lightly. She had played for others, yes, but she had also played for herself, claiming a part of her life that had been buried under years of work and quiet survival. She pressed a few notes, savoring the sound.
Oh.
Feeling the energy of the day still lingering in the room, the memory of the students who had laughed at, first but now listened with awe, stayed with her. She realized that courage was not just about standing up to fear, it was about letting yourself be vulnerable, about risking judgment, and about trusting that your own voice, your own talent, could shine even when others doubted you. And today she had done that, walking home under the evening sky. The city lights reflecting softly on the wet pavement, she hummed the melody she had played. It was more than a tune, it was a promise. A promise to herself that she would continue, that she would not let doubt or ridicule stop her again. The piano had reminded her of who she was. But the people in the cafe had reminded her that the world was capable of seeing her too. If she allowed it, for the first time, she felt a quiet but powerful confidence. She had faced laughter and skepticism, and she had turned it into respect and wonder. She had shared something deeply personal and beautiful, and it had been received with open hearts. The piano had become more than an instrument, it was a bridge between her past, her hidden talent, and a future that suddenly seemed full of possibility. And as she walked home, the hum of the city blending with the memory of the day's music, she knew this was only the beginning. The cafe, the piano, the people who had laughed first, they had all played a part in a story that was still unfolding. And she was ready to see where it would go, one note at a time. The next morning, she arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. The streets were quiet, the air crisp, and the world still waking up. She carried a small bag with her, stuffed with cleaning cloths and aprons. But her mind was already on the piano waiting in the corner. The memory of yesterday's performance lingered, replaying in her head like a quiet echo. People had seen her talent, had stopped laughing, had listened. It had been overwhelming, but also freeing. She unlocked the cafe doors and stepped inside. The usual smells of coffee and pastries greeted her, comforting and familiar. The tables were empty, the chairs stacked neatly, but the piano sat in the corner, silent, almost expectant. She approached it, brushing the dust lightly from the keys. Her fingers hovered above them for a moment, feeling the warmth of the wood, remembering the music she had played yesterday. Something about the piano seemed different now, alive in a way it had never been before, as she worked through her morning routine. Tidying the counters and filling sugar containers, the regulars began to trickle in. Some glanced at her with smiles, others nodded politely, but today there was an unusual air of curiosity. Everyone seemed to want to see if the magic of yesterday would appear again. And deep down, she felt the same nervous anticipation that had carried her through the previous day. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread. Some of the regular customers had brought friends. Even a few of the college students from the day before returned, hesitant and unsure. They remembered the piano, remembered the music, and they wanted to see if it was real or just a fluke. She noticed their eyes following her, some with admiration, others with skepticism. It was at that moment, she finished arranging the tables, that someone spoke up from the corner. "How did you learn to play like that?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. Everyone in the cafe paused, curious, waiting for an answer. She hadn't intended to reveal much, but now something in her shifted. The piano had given her confidence. And maybe it was time to share a part of her story. She took a deep breath and began softly. her voice carrying gently across the cafe. I started playing when I was very young. My parents gave me lessons, and I practiced for hours every day. Music was everything to me. It was how I expressed myself, how I felt alive. She paused, glancing down at her hands resting on the piano. But life doesn't always go as you plan. There were times I had to stop. I had to work to survive, and the piano became a memory.
Oh.
The room fell silent, every eye on her. Some faces showed surprise, some understanding, and others admiration. No one laughed. No one mocked. They could feel the honesty in her words, the depth of her experience. The students from the day before shifted in their seats. Leaning forward, intrigued by the story behind the music they had heard, she continued, her voice steady now. I never thought I'd play again. I thought that part of me was gone, but yesterday I sat down and remembered. The notes came back to me, slowly at first, and then more clearly. It reminded me that I am still here, that my music is still here, waiting. Her eyes lifted, meeting the gaze of those listening. I wasn't playing for you at first. I was playing for me. But I am glad you heard it, and I hope it touched something in you too. A soft murmur of appreciation rippled through the cafe. A woman near the counter whispered, "It's incredible. She's so talented." Another customer nodded, unable to find words to express what they felt. The atmosphere was different from the previous days, more intimate, more connected. Everyone seemed to understand that this was not just a performance. It was a revelation, a glimpse into the life of someone who had been invisible for too long. Then she began to play. Not a song to impress, not a show to entertain, but a melody that told her story. The music rose and fell like her own journey, the quiet moments of doubt, the bursts of hope, the long stretches of silence where she had waited and wondered if her talent had been forgotten. Each note carried her memories, her struggles, and her triumphs as she played. She thought about the years she had spent practicing in a small, dimly lit room, alone except for the music. She remembered the tears she had shed when life forced her to leave the piano behind. She remembered the fear of failing, of being judged, of being invisible. And she remembered the joy she had felt when she first touched the keys. When the music poured out without hesitation, her audience was captivated. Even those who had been skeptical, who had come to mock or doubt, were now completely absorbed. Some leaned forward, resting their elbows on tables, their faces soft with emotion. Others closed their eyes, letting the melody wash over them. The students from the day before had stopped whispering. Now fully attentive, their previous arrogance replaced by awe. The cafe owner, standing quietly by the counter, felt a lump rise in his throat. He had worked in the cafe for years, seen many people come and go, but he had never witnessed anything like this. The music was not just skillful, it was heartfelt, alive, and transformative. He glanced around at the customers, seeing their reactions, and realized that something extraordinary was unfolding in his cafe. In the corner where the piano sat quietly, waiting, she played for a long time, letting the story of her life unfold through the music. Each note was deliberate, each chord infused with emotion. The room seemed to breathe with her, every listener drawn into the narrative. It was a dialogue without words, a conversation between her heart and the hearts of everyone present. When she finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost tangible. No one spoke at first. The air was thick with emotion, heavy with the shared experience of witnessing something beautiful and true. Then, slowly, applause began. Tentative at first, then stronger, louder, echoing through the cafe. It was sincere, heartfelt, and it filled her with a quiet joy that she hadn't expected. The students who had come to laugh the day before were now among the loudest clappers. One of them stood, smiling broadly, saying, "I can't believe I doubted you. That was amazing." Another nodded, adding, "You told a story with your music. I've never seen anything like it." She felt a warm glow at their words, realizing that the music had done more than entertain, had reached people in a way that words could not. The regular customers approached her, asking questions about her past, her training, and her experiences. She answered quietly, sharing what she felt comfortable with, and noticed how people leaned in, eager to understand more about the person behind the music. It was a connection she had never experienced in the cafe before. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not just as a waitress, but as a person with a story worth listening to. Even the cafe owner approached her, his expression a mixture of pride and wonder. "I didn't know this was in you," he said softly. "We've all underestimated you, I think. Maybe we need to rethink what this cafe could be. You could perform more often. People would come just to hear you play." She smiled, humbled, but also excited. The idea had never crossed her mind. She had played for herself, never imagining that others might want to hear more. The music had done more than reveal her talent. It had opened a door to possibility. She realized that the piano had been waiting for her all these years, not just to make music, but to remind her that she could reclaim a part of herself that she had thought lost. And now, the people around her had become witnesses to her journey, sharing in the triumph and the beauty of her story. Throughout the day, the cafe buzzed with a new energy. Customers who had come for coffee stayed longer, lingering near the piano, watching her as she worked, waiting for another chance to hear her play. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful, as if everyone understood that something rare and precious was happening. The piano was no longer just an object in the corner. It had become the heart of the space, alive with the history and the talent of the woman who played it. When the day finally ended and the last customers left, she stayed behind once more, sitting at the piano and pressing a few quiet notes. She thought about the reactions, the faces, the admiration, and the connection she had felt. It was overwhelming, but also deeply comforting. She had shared a piece of her soul, and it had been met with understanding and respect. As she left the cafe that evening, the city lights shimmering on wet streets, she felt a quiet determination. This was no longer just about playing for herself. She had a story to share, a gift to give, and now an audience that would listen. The laughter that had greeted her in the past had been replaced by attention, admiration, and possibility. She had reclaimed her music, her voice, and her presence. She knew there would be challenges ahead. Not everyone would understand. Not every day would be perfect. But she had proven to herself and to others that her talent and her passion were real. They had been hidden, but never gone. And as she walked home, humming the melody she had played, she realized that the piano had done more than awaken her talent, had awakened her confidence, her courage, and her sense of belonging in the world once more. The cafe had become a place of transformation. What had begun as a simple, quiet job had turned into a stage, a platform, and a bridge to something greater. And she knew, with a certainty she hadn't felt in years, that her journey was only beginning. The piano had reminded her of who she was. And now, the world was ready to see her, truly see her. For the first time, the cafe was quiet in the early morning, the soft light from the windows casting long shadows across the tables. She arrived early, carrying her apron and a few supplies, but her eyes were already on the piano in the corner. It had become her anchor, her comfort, and her stage. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, feeling the familiar warmth of the wood, the smoothness of the worn surfaces. The piano had been with her through so much, through fear, doubt, and rediscovery, and now it held more than sound. It held possibility. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered, curious and eager. Word had spread quickly about the woman who could transform a quiet cafe into a place of awe and beauty. Regulars arrived first, smiling at her with warmth and familiarity. Then came newcomers, drawn by curiosity, hoping to witness something extraordinary. Even some of the students from the earlier days returned, sheepish and apologetic. Eager to see her play again, she approached the piano with a quiet determination. The first notes were gentle, a whisper of sound, like the beginning of a story being told. The audience leaned in, hushed, as if afraid to disturb the moment. She let the melody build slowly, letting the music carry her own memories, her struggles, and her hope. Each note was deliberate, filled with emotion, telling a story that words could not capture as she played. She felt herself lifting higher, carried by the connection between her and the listeners. She realized something important. The music was no longer just hers. It had become a bridge, linking her life to the lives of the people who had once overlooked her. Faces softened, eyes glimmered, and hearts opened in ways she hadn't imagined. She was no longer invisible. She was seen, heard, and understood. The cafe owner watched from behind the counter, amazed at the transformation happening before his eyes. He had seen performers before, but none had touched the space in this way. The piano, once neglected, had become the heart of the cafe, and the woman playing it had become its soul. He approached cautiously after she finished a piece, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. "You've changed this place," he said quietly. "People come to see you play. You have something special," she smiled, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "I never thought people would care," she admitted softly. "I only play because I love it, but it feels nice to know it reaches others." The owner nodded, understanding that the magic wasn't in the applause, but in the connection. The shared experience of music that transcended words. Over the next few weeks, the cafe became a destination. People came not just for coffee, but to hear her play. Some days, she would arrive to find a small audience already waiting, quietly seated, anticipating the music that had become a part of their routine. She played each day with sincerity, letting the piano tell stories of hope, resilience, and the beauty of unexpected moments. Local journalists began to take notice. A small article in the community newspaper praised the cafe and highlighted her performances. Video clips shared online started to gain attention, spreading the word beyond the streets of her city. The once quiet waitress who had been laughed at was becoming known for something extraordinary. And through it all, she remained grounded, focusing on the music rather than the recognition. One afternoon, a man approached the cafe with a folder under his arm. He introduced himself as a manager for a local concert hall, interested in featuring local talent. She was hesitant at first, unsure if she was ready for such a stage. But he spoke with genuine warmth and encouragement. "We've seen your videos," he said. "People are captivated by your music. You have a gift, and it should be shared with more than just this cafe." She thought about her past, the years of quiet practice, the long hours of work, the times she had almost given up. She thought about the piano, dusty and waiting, that had reminded her of who she was. And she thought about the people who had laughed at first, only to be silenced by what she could do. Taking a deep breath, she agreed. It was terrifying, but it felt right. She had waited long enough for courage to catch up with her. The day of her first concert arrived, and she felt a familiar nervousness settle in her chest. She had performed in front of the cafe, in front of friends and strangers, but this was different. The hall was larger, the audience unfamiliar, and the stakes higher. She walked to the piano on stage, ran her fingers over the keys, and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. The music filled the hall instantly. It moved like a river, gentle at first, then powerful, flowing into every corner of the room. The audience was silent, captivated. Her fingers danced across the keys, telling stories of resilience, hope, and joy. Each note carried the weight of her journey, her struggles, and her victories. She could see faces lifted in emotion, hear the subtle sighs of awe, feel the energy of connection that had always been at the heart of her music. By the time she finished, the applause was overwhelming. Standing ovations, cheers, and tears in the eyes of strangers who had never known her story. She realized in that moment that the laughter she had faced years ago had no power over her anymore. Her music had spoken, and the world had listened. Returning to the cafe afterward, she found the piano waiting, silent yet full of memory. She ran her fingers over the keys, feeling the comfort of the familiar. The cafe had been her beginning, the place where she had faced doubt and ridicule, the stage where she had first discovered her voice. Now, it was a place of celebration, of recognition, and of community. People came not just to drink coffee, but to feel the music. To share in the experience she created, she began teaching a few students in the cafe, sharing her love of music with those who had never had a chance to play. Watching them learn, watching their eyes light up as they discovered their own potential, reminded her of why she had chosen to play in the first place. Music was not just sound, it was connection, it was hope, it was life. and she had the power to give that gift to others. Her life slowly transformed. Offers to perform at local events, community centers, and schools came in. She remained humble, grounded in her love for the piano rather than chasing fame. Each performance was a story, each note a conversation with the audience. People who had once laughed at her or ignored her now became fans, supporters, and friends. They respected her not just for her talent, but for the courage it took to share it after years of silence. Through it all, she remembered the quiet moments alone with the piano in the cafe, when no one was watching, when it was just her and the music. Those moments had given her the strength to face fear, the confidence to share her gift, and the belief that even when the world seemed indifferent, she could still shine. Years later, she would look back on that time and smile. The cafe, the piano, the first audience that laughed at her, they had all played a part in her story. Without them, she might never have discovered the power she carried inside. The piano had changed everything, but more importantly, she had changed everything by daring to play. Her life was no longer quiet. It was full of music, of people, of connection, and of opportunities she had never imagined. She continued to work at the cafe, but now with pride and joy, knowing that her place there was not just behind the counter, but in the hearts of everyone who came to listen. The laughter that had greeted her in the past had long faded, replaced by admiration, love, and respect. And every time she sat at the piano, her fingers brushing the keys, she remembered the journey, how she had been overlooked, underestimated, and laughed at. She remembered the fear, the doubt, and the courage it took to play anyway. And she remembered the joy, the connection, and the power of music to change not just the world around her, but the world inside her as well. She had waited for years, silently, patiently, never forgetting the music that lived in her heart. And now, the music was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who listened, everyone who believed, and everyone who had ever needed a reminder that talent, courage, and persistence could transform a life. The cafe continued to thrive. The piano continued to sing, and she continued to play, not for recognition, not for applause, but for the sheer love of the music, and for the knowledge that the world could change when one person dared to share what they had inside. The woman who had once been just a quiet waitress had found her voice, and in doing so, had reminded everyone that even the smallest, overlooked corners of the world could hold extraordinary beauty. Her story was no longer just about music. It was about courage, perseverance, and the power of never giving up on what you love. The piano had been the key, but she had been the heart, and together they had created something unforgettable.